Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. Wilson College is a very beautiful place, and if I had known that, I would have done my PhD here and not at the Indian Statistical Institute. But anyway, I'm happy that you are here, and not only in a beautiful college, but also a place that has an atmosphere of learning and creativity. The title of today's talk is The Ups and Downs of Social Policy in India, and much of what I wanted to say actually appeared in print this morning in Indian Express. So to make things easy for myself, I will start by reading that article and adding a few comments here and there. And then after that, can you hear? Can you hear? Yeah? Okay. If you can't hear, then just raise your hand. Huh? And then after that, I would like to say something about Aadhaar, partly because Aadhaar looms large on social policy today, and partly because yesterday I spent some time at the Reserve Bank of India and we discussed the Aadhaar-based payment systems, and I'm really quite worried about what Aadhaar is doing to rural banking in particular and to the banking facilities available to poor people. But starting with social policy, before I get to the article, let me say one thing, that there is in India a kind of cultivated resistance to the idea of expanding the social sector and having active social policies, or what some people would call the welfare state. I don't like that expression too much. I'll explain why later, but we can use it in the meantime. And when I say cultivated resistance, the cultivation is mainly by the corporate-sponsored media, which is most of the media today, for reasons that are not very difficult to understand, because if you increase social spending, then typically you would have to raise taxes, or interest rates might go up if you borrow the money, or you might have to reduce expenditure on corporate incentives and subsidies and so on, of course, and all these are things that the corporate sector would rather to avoid. So there's a tendency to argue against or to disparage social spending. But if you dig deeper and ask where that resistance comes from, aside from the fact that the business interests are largely against it, I think that there are at least three main factors. One is ignorance, one is selfishness, and one is cynicism. So briefly, starting with ignorance, what I have in mind is ignorance of the historical role of the welfare state in development around the world and what it has contributed to some of the biggest achievements in improving the quality of life. One of the most significant things that happened in the 20th century is a big expansion in the constructive role of the state in many countries. If you look, for example, at the OECD countries of today, basically the rich countries, and you go back 100 years, and you look at the share of government expenditure in GDP, for about 20 countries for which we have data, it was around 10%. So 10% of the GDP was public expenditure, and most of that was law and order, military expenditure, and that sort of thing. Not much was social services. By the end of the 20th century, in the same countries, the share of public expenditure in GDP had risen to something like 40% on average, rising to 50 or even 60% in countries like Sweden and other Scandinavian countries that are not doing badly at all. Furthermore, if you look at the composition of this 40% of GDP, typically something like 2/3 consists of health, education, and social security alone. So these are big, so what we call the social sector is actually a big part, not just of government expenditure, but also of the economy and the society as a whole in many countries. And this expansion of the constructive role of the state has facilitated some of the big improvements in the quality of life. And just to give one critical example of great importance for India, here is a, oh, sorry. Oops. Sorry. Here is a map of the countries that have a health system based on the principle of universal healthcare, UHC. The basic principle is that nobody should be deprived of quality healthcare for lack of ability to pay. Okay? So in blue are the countries that are, it's never 100% of course, it's a kind of ideal, but many countries, as you can see now, have a healthcare system that is based on that principle and achieves it in substantial measure. And then in green, there are countries that at that time, this is a few years ago, were still in the process of moving towards universal healthcare. And then in gray are the other countries. I'm not certain where this map comes from. I downloaded it from the internet if you want to know. But I think, so to my knowledge, it is actually fairly credible. Sometimes I think it comes from the CIA, because if you have a good eyesight, you can see that there are two countries in orange, Iraq and Afghanistan. And the legend says, Iraq and Afghanistan, universal health coverage provided by US war funding. This is a very weird comment. I think they are referring to universal for the US Army or something like that. Anyway, so as you can see, not only is universal healthcare now the basic principle in all the rich countries of the world, with the notable exception of the United States, with dreadful consequences, it is also becoming the norm in a larger and larger number of developing countries in Latin America, Brazil, Cuba, of course, for a long time, Sri Lanka, very close to India, Vietnam, today perhaps would be, if not in blue, at least in green. Thailand would be in blue today. So if you exclude Africa and you look at the population of this combined blue region, it's about half of the world population. It's quite a significant thing. India, unfortunately, is still very far from universal healthcare, and in fact, we've not even reached the stage of having a vibrant and sensible debate about it. What we have instead is stunts like Ayushman Bharat. It's not actually just a stunt, but it's not much more. I mean, I'll come back to that later, actually. But anyway, there was a brief moment of discussion about universal healthcare a few years ago, when a committee appointed by the Planning Commission presented a proposal for universal healthcare, but then it died out again. So we're really far from getting there, because after you start a sensible discussion, it typically takes a long time. It's a very complex thing to do, to organize free healthcare for everybody. By the way, there are many ways of doing it. It's not like there's one way of doing it. If you look at countries like the UK, or for that matter Cuba, the way it's done is that all the healthcare, or most of the healthcare, is simply provided by public institutions like government hospitals and university health centers and so on and so forth. So that's the public provision approach. That's one way of doing it. And then, so it's basically the idea that healthcare should be a public service. It's like you go to a library, you just go there, nobody asks you whether you're rich or poor or upper caste or lower caste, and you don't have to pay. It's a public service. Or if there's a fire in your house, you call the fire brigade. They don't waste time asking you to fill a form or anything, or who you are. They just come and they deal with the fire. So it's the same thing. You're ill, you go to a health center and you get health care. You don't have to bring your wallet because it's all free. Okay. And then there are countries that do it differently, like Canada, where some of the healthcare is provided by public institution, but some of it is provided by private institution, and you can choose where you go. But again, you don't pay, because everyone is part, by law, of a compulsory and universal social insurance system, not private insurance, social insurance system. It's actually not countrywide, it's province-wide. But anyway, within each province, there is a single social health insurance fund. Everyone is part of it, everyone contributes, and when you are ill, you are taken care of. And then there are countries that have a mixture of public provision and social insurance, including very important examples for India like Brazil and Thailand. But the point is, one way or another, you have to ensure that everyone is taken care of when they are ill. Okay, so ignorance is the first factor. Second factor is selfishness, and I've already covered it to some extent when I talked about the business interests. In every country in the world, the privileged classes try to rationalize their privileges and nurture the illusion that they don't owe anything to anybody else. For example, by thinking that they deserve what they get because it was their own doing. If you think of it objectively, for example, if you ask yourselves why you are here in this nice and well-functioning college, it really doesn't have that much to do with your own efforts. It may have something to do, but it has a lot to do with where you were born, which family, which caste or class, and even your educational achievements in school have a lot to do with your teachers and your parents' efforts. So frankly speaking, it's more chance than anything else, and if that's the case, then anyone with a minimum sense of fairness would agree that the rich owe something to the poor. That's not just what it's all about. I'll come back to that in a second, but it is part of it. And then in India, as elsewhere, the rich try to often, not all of them of course, but many of them try to somehow distance themselves from that obligation. And maybe it's a particularly serious problem in India because of the huge inequalities, not just the inequalities of class and economic inequalities, but on top of that, the caste inequalities, patriarchy and all that, and that creates a huge social distance between the privileged and the underprivileged, and that makes it difficult, of course, to cultivate a sense of solidarity. The third factor is cynicism, and that is not confined to the business sector by any means. There's also sometimes a lot of cynicism coming from the left. So the right tends to say that, you know, the public sector in India really doesn't work and cannot work because they would like it to be privatized, and the left tends to say something similar, that it's not, if not it cannot work, at least it doesn't work, because they really don't want the government to be able to take credit for anything. And then on top of that, of course, we have the fact that the media always tends to focus on the negative aspects of public services because that's kind of more noteworthy, more newsworthy. So the effect of that is that we get the impression that nothing is working, when actually that's not quite the case at all. Of course, many things are either not working or not working well enough, that's for sure. But I don't think there's any evidence that things can't improve or be made to work. In fact, the entire history in India and around the world is that if you really put your energy and resources, not just financial resources, but also political resources, in making healthcare or education or social security work, you can really achieve important results. Even in India, there's a lot of experience of that, not just in one or two superstar states like Kerala or Himachal Pradesh, but also increasingly in many other states as well. Okay, I mentioned earlier that I didn't like the word welfare state so much. Then the reason is that firstly, it's not just the welfare, firstly it has a kind of paternalistic ring, and also it gives the impression that it's about the rich helping the poor, but that's not just what it's all about. It's also about solidarity among large sections of the population that have a stake in quality public services. For example, universal healthcare. One reason why it's so popular around the world, despite all the factors of resistance that I mentioned and that apply in many other countries as well, is that a huge part of the population has a stake in it, not just the poor. If we had a good healthcare system in India based on the principle of universal healthcare, even you and I would benefit from it. I'm sure that many of you, if not all of you, have experiences of exploitation in the private medical sector, being overcharged, being told that unnecessary procedures are actually essential, that diagnostics of all kinds have to be done urgently, when actually that's not the case. So there are many reasons, relatively well understood in economics, why private provision of healthcare is quite problematic. And that's one reason why, if we had a good, publicly managed healthcare system, most of us would actually benefit from it. So it's not just about the welfare of the poor, and it's not just about the state either, because many critical provisions in fields like health and education actually come from, not from the state, of course the state is very important, but also from a range of private non-profit institutions like churches, NGOs, trade unions, community associations, and in fact some of the best healthcare and education institutions around the world, including in India, come from that sector and not from the state sector. So it's not only about the state, maybe something like solidarity society would be a better term, but anyway. Okay, so now in spite of all the resistance that I have mentioned, there is some progress in that direction in India, and in fact, of course, many of these ideas about public arrangements for healthcare, education, social security, redistribution, and some of the rights that may be needed for putting all this in place, like the right to education, the right to social security, and so on. All these things are part of the Indian Constitution. Of course, they are mostly in the Directive Principles section, and as you would know, the Directive Principles were not supposed to be enforceable in a court of law, at least in the initial scheme of things. But the Directive Principles of the Constitution are preceded by another very important article, Article 37, which says that these principles are fundamental to the governance of the country and they will be taken into account in making laws. So while the Directive Principles themselves may not be directly enforceable, the idea is that laws would be put in place to give expressions to the rights that are enshrined in the Directive Principles. And that has begun to happen to some extent in the last 20 years or so, not starting with the UPA government, by the way, starting a little earlier than that. For example, education was made a fundamental right in 2002, and some important social programs like midday meals, for example, were started around 2001. But there was some progress also in the period of the UPA government. But unfortunately, in the last 5 years, things have come to a bit of a standstill, and this is where I now come to this article that appeared this morning, and I will read it along with adding a few comments. As the country inches towards parliamentary elections, a deep confusion pervades the realm of social policy. When the Modi government came to power 5 years ago, there were high expectations of a rollback in welfare schemes. The previous government, so went the story, had gone overboard in social spending, and Modi would set this right. In fact, the UPA government had only initiated a much-needed revamping of India's underdeveloped social sector, with some important results, as we learned later from the 4th National Family Health Survey and other sources. But corporate-sponsored think tanks, generally hostile to social spending, preferred to argue that it was time to rein in the welfare state. I've already commented on a lot of this. There's one sentence here about the fact that what happened in the previous government actually achieved some results. That was not so clear at that time, but it became clear later on with the data of the rapid survey of children being released, and more importantly the 4th National Family Health Survey, which showed that a whole range of social indicators had started progressing much faster in the previous 10 years than they did before that, between NFHS 1 and NFHS 2, or between NFHS 2 and NFHS 3. Swati, who is sitting here, has done some work on this, among others. There's a very clear acceleration of progress in that period, which indicates that things were actually moving in the right direction, and that the thing to do at that time was to consolidate what had already been done and to move further in the right direction. And it's not just the National Family Health Survey. There are also other studies that shows that programs like midday meals, for example, social security pensions, even the public distribution system actually achieves something very important from the point of view of poor people. It really gives them an important source of public support and economic security. But that was not the reading at that time. The narrative was that things had gone wrong, it was all a waste, and we should go back to other concerns. Until recently, the Modi government seemed to abide by that script. It certainly showed little interest in social policy during the last 5 years. The 2015-16 union budget gave dramatic expression to this indifference with deep cuts in budget allocations for many social programs. Of course, these cuts could be partly justified on the grounds that the states were receiving a higher share of the indivisible pool of taxes. It was raised from 32% to 42%. So that could justify some of the reductions. But the cuts went much further, and the axe fell particularly heavily on children, with initial cuts of around 36% and 50% for midday meals and the integrated child development services, respectively. 50% cut in the ICDS budget initially. When I asked a very senior finance ministry official 1 year later how this had happened, he first said that he was not aware of it, and then explained that the cuts had been made at the last minute in a hurry without paying much attention to the details. Now this is really scary. I mean, here is somebody sitting very close to the top of the finance ministry who's telling you that he is not aware that the budget for children's programs have been cut by 36 to 50% in the previous budget, and who says, well, you know, it just happened because we were not paying attention. That tells you something. The cuts of 50% for ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Services, which by the way is one of the most important social. Nothing is more important for the future of the country than the health and nutrition and well-being of children. And ICDS is the main national program we have for this purpose. And it's not a bad program. It's working, achieving some very important results in many states, not all states, but there's a clear trend now of improvement in many states, and a real hope that in the not too distant future, it will really help to ensure good nutrition and health for young children. The budget for ICDS was cut by 50% initially. It was so outrageous and catastrophic that even the government's own Minister of Women and Child Development, Maneka Gandhi, had to protest and embarrass the government, and then after that the cuts were reversed to some extent, but not fully. The budget for midday meals was not, the budget cuts for midday meals were not reversed, and to this day the central government expenditure on midday meals is less than 10 years ago in money terms, not in real terms. In real terms it's even less. Okay, so there were something really dramatic happened at that time. There are many other examples of the indifference, if not hostility, of the central government to social policy in the last 5 years. Maternity entitlements, a legal right of all Indian women, except those already covered in the formal sector under the National Food Security Act of 2013, were ignored for years and are brazenly violated to this day. The rights of workers employed under NREGA have also been undermined by budget cuts, erratic wage payments, and the vagaries of technocracy. The central government's contribution to social security pensions for the elderly has been frozen at a measly 200 rupees per month for the last 12 years or so, despite repeated appeals for more from various quarters, including a letter from 60 eminent Indian economists who wrote to the finance minister suggesting a modest increase from 200 rupees per month to 500 rupees per month last year, and then again this year. This was ignored in both cases. With the partial exception of Swachh Bharat Mission, there have been no major initiatives in the social sector in the last 5 years. Most of the government's efforts have gone into promoting Aadhaar and saving money rather than protecting people's entitlements. I think if you had to summarize social policy in 2 words today, it would be save money. That's what the budget cuts were about. I don't have time to go into all the examples I gave in this paragraph, but just to give one, which you may not be familiar with, the maternity entitlements. Under the National Food Security Act, every woman in India is entitled to cash benefits of 6,000 rupees per child for every child. The law is very clear, every child. Until 2017, if not 18, almost 5 years, this was simply ignored by the central government. The Supreme Court raised the question from time to time because at that time the Supreme Court was monitoring the implementation of the Food Security Act. So from time to time they asked the government, what are you doing about maternity entitlements? And the government got away by promising each time that it's going to happen soon. There was a pilot scheme at that time, which went back much earlier, for maternity benefits in 53 districts. And the government kept saying that this is going to be extended to the entire country, but it didn't happen. Finally, soon after demonetization, so demonetization happened on the 8th of November 2016, yeah? And of course, things didn't go too well after that for some time. So on the 31st of December 2016, as a kind of way of sweetening the pill, the Prime Minister announced that maternity benefits will be provided to Indian women as if it was a new scheme. He made no reference to the Food Security Act. He didn't explain that we are finally doing what we should have been doing 5 years ago. He gave the impression that in our generosity we are going to start providing maternity benefits. And then in pursuance of that announcement, because of course the moment the Prime Minister makes that kind of announcement, it becomes the priority, a scheme was put in place in 2017 called Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana, which gives 5,000 rupees, not 6,000 rupees, 5,000 rupees per child, for one child per family, not even per woman, per family, okay? So this is again an example where the government the priority is actually to save money and not to respect or promote people's entitlements. The restriction to one child is completely illegal because the Act says very clearly that it should be for all children. And the restriction from 6,000, the reduction from 6,000 to 5,000 was made on the grounds that 2/3 of women get another 1,400 rupees from JSY, the Janani Suraksha Yojana, when they have an institutional delivery. 2/3 of 1,400 is about 1,000, so we deduct that from the 6,000 maternity benefits. Now this is completely illogical because a right is a right. It's not an average right. You know, when every woman is entitled to 600 rupees per child, there's no question of an average woman getting 600 rupees per child. And secondly, JSY has its own purpose. It's not a maternity entitlement program. So the two schemes cannot be conflated with each other, and the JSY money cannot be counted as a form of maternity benefit. Okay, so there were a lot of things like that, where the priority clearly was to save money rather than to expand social benefits. As the next elections approach, however, the NDA government seems to be changing gear, if not making a U-turn. Suddenly it has rediscovered that millions of poor people in India desperately need public support for their survival and well-being. As a starter, the government announced a grand health insurance scheme, Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, which is part of Ayushman Bharat, which claims to cover up to 5 lakh rupees of health expenditure every year for 10 crore families. Sounds huge. It is another matter that this is actually a hospitalization insurance scheme. It covers only hospitalization costs with a tiny budget. I'll come back to that. In the same vein, the finance minister recently announced a mega scheme for contributory pensions in the informal sector. Here again, the claims and promises are out of line with actual budget commitments, only 500 crores of rupees per year for this year, but they serve the real purpose, which is to win votes. Meanwhile, the budget for non-contributory pensions for widows and the elderly was quietly reduced by more than 600 crores. So they actually, again, they're saving money, but giving the impression that they're taking a big initiative. As far as Ayushman Bharat and Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana is concerned, I am not against the idea of hospitalization insurance. It's a very limited form of health insurance. It's nothing like this. That's a completely different idea. Hospitalization insurance is a form of economic insurance against, a form of insurance against an economic contingency, that if you are ill or you have an accident, you have to go to the hospital. Obviously, sometimes it's an expensive bad thing. So I'm not against the principle, but we should not confuse that with proper health insurance, let alone universal health care. And we should certainly not think that this is the biggest health scheme in the world, as the government is claiming. That's really a joke. I mean, look, the budget for this year, the budget last year was 2,000 crores of rupees, which is not even peanuts, it's peanut shells. This year it's 6,000 crores, which is barely 100 rupees per person for the target group of 500 million person. And some people seem to have the illusion that when you put the money in an insurance premium, somehow it gets multiplied. I mean, that's not true at all. Insurance cannot transform 100 rupees into more. What insurance does is to redistribute the money towards those who need it most, the ones who are being hospitalized and need money. But it cannot transform 100 rupees into more, so it's 100 rupees per person. And just to give you an idea of how inadequate this is, I'll do it in two ways. One is that if you look at public expenditure on health as a proportion of GDP, it's been roughly 1% in India for a long time, at least 25 years, a little bit more than 1% perhaps, hovering around 1%, 1.2, 1.3%, compared with, I'll just give you some figures for comparison, if I can find them, sorry, compared with 2.5% in sub-Saharan Africa, 3% in East Asia and Middle East, and 8% in the European Union. So India is one of the countries that have the lowest level of public spending on healthcare in the world. And this Ayushman Bharat is going to add 0.03% to the 1%. So it just really doesn't make any difference. If you look at a country, I mean, forget Europe, look at Thailand. And Thailand is an interesting case, really, because firstly, they have a pretty good healthcare system based on the principle of universal healthcare, with a mixture of public provision and social insurance. And if you just look at the social insurance part, which covers not only hospitalization, but also other forms of healthcare, and by the way was initiated almost 20 years ago, at a time when per capita GDP in Thailand was very similar to what it is today. So they were no richer at that time than India is today, but they were able to go into this big healthcare program. And today, the expenditure just for the social insurance part is about 100 as much in per capita terms as this Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana. So it's a completely different order of magnitude. So to spend 6,000 crores of rupees and claim that you're launching the biggest healthcare system in the world is really a bit of a joke. Okay, I have to find my notes again. Now, the Prime Minister did allocate big money, 75,000 crores, for the new scheme of direct cash transfers to farmers, PM Kisan. That's big money, that's not just symbolic. This is the most tangible sign of the NDA government's U-turn on social policy. Suddenly, they are investing, not saving money. Perhaps this scheme, PM Kisan, is better than nothing. The poor in India do need income support, and this is one way of going about it. But is it the best way? I doubt it very much. Quite likely, many well-off farmers and perhaps also business owners who happen to own a little land and can pass as farmers will take advantage of the scheme, while many vulnerable groups, starting with landless laborers, who are actually poorer than the farmers, are left out. If there is time in the discussion, we could discuss what the alternatives are, including UBI, QUBRI, QUIT, and all these proposals. The net result of this pre-electoral frenzy is an ill-thought assortment of second-rate social programs. The opposition parties, unfortunately, are adding to the confusion. The Congress Party, for instance, seems to be committing itself to a very strange minimum income guarantee scheme. This is very recent. The idea, according to recent statements from Rahul Gandhi and P. Chidambaram, is that if you earn less than the minimum income, the government will pay the difference. So let's say the minimum is 10,000 rupees per month. If you earn 5,000 rupees per month, then the government will give you 5,000 rupees per month so that everyone reaches the minimum. This makes no sense. For one thing, it is wholly impractical. How is the government supposed to estimate this income gap household-wise? We just don't have that information, and we cannot collect that information. Why would people tell you? For another, it would mean that anyone who earns less than the minimum income might as well give up working, since the government is going to fill the gap anyway. If you earn 5,000 and the government is going to bring you to 10,000, then why not earn 0? The government will bring you to 10,000. Well, you're laughing, but you know, it's actually a serious issue. According to some media reports, this odd idea has the support of top development economists like Angus Deaton, Thomas Piketty, and Abhijit Banerjee. These are the super heavyweights of economic development economics. You can't get heavier than that. I mean, this is like the black belts of the black belts. This is just hot air. On further inquiry, it turns out that none of them are backing a specific proposal, sympathetic as they certainly are to various forms of income and wealth distribution. All three would be very much in favor of more redistribution, some form of income support, more taxes for the rich, and so on. But, and this is based on personal communication with them, none of them are at the moment backing a specific proposal, and certainly not this one. Meanwhile, no major political party has proposed bold initiatives in the fields of health and education. These are just as important as income support. In fact, India desperately needs a big national initiative for universal quality education. This is essential not only to help people out of poverty, but also to deal with the country's oppressive web of economic and social inequalities. A great leap towards universal healthcare, I've talked about that, going well beyond the gestures of Ayushman Bharat, is also long overdue. It is good that both government and opposition parties are sparing a thought for poor people as elections approach, but the current scramble to win their votes is in danger of breeding half-baked plans and expensive stunts. What India needs is a well-thought effort to consolidate the foundations of a lasting social security system. So what is happening is not entirely bad. It is always the case in an electoral democracy, including India, that a lot of initiatives take place around the time of election. If you look at the history of elections in India and of social policy, and especially at the state level, you will see that many of the good things that happened just before or around the time of elections. So it's a good thing that there's a little bit of momentum right now. But at the moment, I don't think it's translating into very attractive proposals. Hopefully, in the near future, in the next few months, this will converge to something more sensible and constructive. But at the moment, I'm a bit worried that there's more confusion than anything else. I wanted to talk about Aadhaar, but I have talked much longer than I thought. How much time should I take? Another 10 minutes? Okay, so I tried to compress the other part. Actually, it was going to be the main part, but I have to compress it in 10 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. So I don't have time to go into all the aspects of Aadhaar. There are many, many issues. There is surveillance, there is the reliability of the technology, there is the benefits such as they are. There's a whole controversy about the savings estimates, and of course there's a lot to discuss about what it's doing to poor people and how Aadhaar has disrupted or derailed a number of welfare schemes. But I want to talk about an aspect of this that has not been discussed sufficiently and worries me a lot. It is what Aadhaar is doing to the banking system, and in particular to banking facilities available to poor people. I will begin by showing you 3 short video clips based on some of the work we have done recently in Jharkhand. Okay. So briefly, the first one, no, not this one. Yeah, the first one is a short testimony from an old widow who lives alone and depends almost entirely on her pension, meager as it is. By the way, I should have mentioned that 200 rupees per month is what the central government contributes, but many states are also contributing, so the total amount is not necessarily just 200 rupees. In many states it's not much more, but in some states it's more. And in Jharkhand at the moment, or at least at the time of this video, it was 600 rupees per month. So for an old woman who lives on her own, 600 rupees is of course very little, but there's a big difference between 600 and 0. So it can be literally a lifeline for these people. And in the last 2 years, she has stopped receiving her pension because she was not able to satisfy the EKYC requirements, the biometric authentication. I'll explain, if I have time, how that works. But the point is she has stopped receiving her pension and she has absolutely no idea of the reason and what she should do for her pension to resume. The second one is an NREGA worker whose wages have suddenly disappeared. They used to come in his bank account, not necessarily within 15 days as the Act requires, but at least they used to get there at some point, and suddenly the money stopped coming, and then he learns from the block officers that it's going into his Airtel wallet, and he didn't even know actually that he had an Airtel wallet. And then he ends by saying that I've decided to stop working for NREGA because, you know, we can't trust that the money will be paid, let alone paid on time. I'll explain again what is this Airtel wallet business. Some of you may be aware of it, but some not. And the third one is a testimony from somebody who is unable to enroll his children in school because on the Aadhaar card, the name of the village is not there. It's the name of the Gram Panchayat. And so the teacher is saying that until the name of the village is on your Aadhaar card, I can't admit you in that school. I'm showing this as examples of the problems that people face, of Aadhaar-related problems that people face. I could show you dozens of testimonies like this. People who don't have Aadhaar, people who have biometric recognition problems, people who have lost their ration card because they were not able to link it on time with Aadhaar, people who can't admit their children, you name it, we have it. But I'm just quickly showing these 3 clips to give you an idea of what's going on. Were you able to follow what was being said? Yeah? Okay. So, now these are just 3 testimonies, of course. When we show this kind of testimonies, very often people say, well, you know, these are just anecdotes and we need some data and so on. I don't really agree. These are not anecdotes. These are the voices of the victims and we have to listen to them, even if there are not many. But on top of that, there are many. You know, as I said, we have loads of these testimonies and there's data, as it happens, showing that there are huge numbers of victims. Just to give you 2 examples, from the government's own data, we know that about 500 crores of rupees of NREGA wage payments are rejected every year now, mainly because of problems related to the Aadhaar payment systems. Now 500 crores is not a small amount, and you can imagine what discouraging effect it has on the NREGA workers, as that man was himself explaining that he has decided to stop working for NREGA. And the other example is that 2 of these 3 testimonies come from a recent survey we did in 2 blocks of Jharkhand, where we visited every single PVTG family. PVTG is particularly vulnerable tribal group. It's of course a particularly marginalized group, but we were shocked, even after a lot of research on these matters, I was shocked to find that there was such a diversity and a quantity of other related problems among these 300 families. 40% of them mentioned at least one serious other related problems, like the ones that I have illustrated, not being able to admit your children in school, not being able to get your NREGA wages, or your pension being discontinued. Now, since time is very short, I'll just say a few words about pensions. Pensions used to be, these are the social security pensions, like the widow pensions that the first person depends on for her livelihood. Before Aadhaar came in the picture, these pensions were paid through bank accounts or post office accounts, in some states in cash, and by the way, cash for this purpose may even be the best system for all we know. But anyway, mostly it was paid through banks and post offices, and it was working. There are many studies that show that these pension programs are actually pretty good. They have low administrative costs, not much corruption, and certainly very little evidence of significant identity fraud. Identity fraud would mean duplicate pension, like the same person getting two pensions, or somebody suffering off somebody else's pension. These are the kinds of identity frauds that Aadhaar is supposed to prevent. There was no evidence that it was a serious problem, and therefore no obvious reason to impose Aadhaar on this program. And yet Aadhaar was made compulsory for pensions, and then Aadhaar enabled payments were initiated. Okay, Aadhaar payment through Aadhaar linked bank account. Again, without obvious rationale. Now, when the government started promoting these Aadhaar linked payments under the name of DBT, I don't really know what it exactly means, but in practice it seems to mean a benefit based on cash, or rather Aadhaar enabled bank payments. In practice that seems to be what it means. So when the government started promoting DBT, it also launched this Jan Dhan Yojana. So there was a huge wave of opening of bank accounts on a massive scale just to meet the targets and impress the country. So the bank manager for weeks were just opening bank accounts left, right and center just to meet the targets without proper scrutiny, without verifying the Aadhaar numbers, and in most cases without biometric authentication, without verifying biometrically that the Aadhaar numbers were correct. So you just get the Aadhaar numbers, can you say, you just ask the Panchayat Sevak ki tum Aadhaar number lao, and then you start opening bank accounts and putting the Aadhaar numbers, quite often without people even knowing that these accounts are being opened, or without them needing that account. Many people, including, by the way, almost all NREGA workers and pensioners, had bank accounts already, but accounts were opened for them. And then, of course, this led to a bit of a mess, because seeding Aadhaar numbers in a hurry in bank accounts is very risky. If you have done any data entry, you will know that entering a 12-digit number in a hurry is very easy to make mistakes. So there were all kinds of typing errors, and not just data entry errors. Sometimes the Aadhaar numbers that were being provided were not the correct ones in the first place. So the Aadhaar seeding was not done properly. And when the government woke up to that later on, to clean up the mess, they started, partly to clean up the mess, also for other reasons, they imposed what is called eKYC. Basically, people had to go back to the bank with all their original documents and authenticate their Aadhaar number with their biometrics. And of course, the problem is that many people don't know that they have to do that, they don't know where to go, they don't know what they're supposed to do, they may have biometric recognition problems, and of course, they don't have a stake in this. I mean, they don't care, they just want their money, right? So the way the government puts pressure to is what I call the ultimatum method. You put a deadline, and then you tell them कि भाई तब तक तुम नहीं करोगे तो तुम्हारा pension नहीं मिलेगा. Then people start rushing to the banks and they cooperate. It is the same ultimatum method that was tried on the middle class for linking of mobiles and bank accounts. They were told कि 31st March tak you have to link your mobile, and we used to get all these SMSs. I also used to get them from Airtel, that if you don't link your mobile, you may be discontinued and so on. So it was the same idea. But it didn't work with the middle class, because the middle class resisted, and so the deadline had to be extended again and again, because you can't really do that kind of thing to the middle class. And ultimately, and actually that's when the mood about Aadhaar started changing, because many of the middle class people started seeing that it's not as cool as it sounded. And then the matter was brought up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court put a little bit of some safeguards in place. But for poor people, the ultimatum method was just fine. You just set the deadline, and after the deadline, you discontinue the benefits. And in Jharkhand, at least, I'm speaking about Jharkhand because I live in Jharkhand, we know for a fact that pensions, ration cards, and job cards were all cancelled in huge numbers because some people were not able to meet the Aadhaar authentication requirements on time, including this widow who is completely in the dark. She doesn't know what's happened to her, and we happen to know, because we inquired into her case, that the reason her pension has been discontinued is that she has not satisfied the eKYC requirement. So a very unfair and damaging situation. But that's only the first part of the story. The second part is that once the accounts were linked with Aadhaar, the government introduced what is called the Aadhaar Bridge Payment System, ABPS, okay? Whereby your Aadhaar becomes your financial address. So if I want to send money to Swati, I don't need to know her bank account number, I don't need to know her IFSC code, I just have to know her Aadhaar number, and then I can send her money. That sounds like magic to a technician. Now, of course, one problem is that some people may have several bank accounts. Then what do you do? So the way the system works is that the money goes automatically to the last Aadhaar linked account. Okay? That's what I call the Lala rule, last Aadhaar linked account. Now, of course, many people don't know that. I didn't know it until quite recently. And think about these people, they have no idea about this rule. And many of them have accounts that they are not aware of, because in the Jan Dhan Yojana excitement, bank accounts were often opened without people's knowledge or without people needing them. So suddenly the money starts getting redirected, and people don't know where to look for their money. And this is a really serious problem. According to one very recent study of the Indian School of Business, in Jharkhand, as many as 38% of wage payments in the last 4 years were redirected to the wrong account. Now, I don't know if it's true or not. It sounds, 38% sounds massive. I have some doubts about the reliability of that figure. But if not 38%, even if it's half or even a quarter of that, this is absolutely abominable. I mean, you make people work hard on these work sites, and then suddenly the money goes all over the place. And this somehow doesn't come to the attention of the government, or if it does, the government typically tries to deny the evidence or refuse to take action. So these are the issues that we were trying to bring up yesterday at the RBI. I'm running out of time, so I'll just say that what I found disturbing yesterday at the RBI is that basically they claim that there's not that much they can do about this, because these Aadhaar-based payment systems are not their babies. They are the babies of the NPCI, the National Payment Corporation of India, which is basically
I had a two-part question. The first part has to do with the idea of building a social security system in India on a large scale. So first you mentioned that it is important or even necessary for India to have that large scale social security system. But on the other hand, you also claim that schemes like Aadhaar and other social schemes have failed because the government hasn't been good enough to implement them. So doesn't that idea contradict each other? If the government is bad at doing things...
I don't think of Aadhaar as a social scheme. Firstly, I don't say that Aadhaar has failed. I could argue that, but I think that would take us into, there are many other aspects to Aadhaar. I was mainly concerned with drawing attention to what is happening in the banking system, because that is not being discussed very much at all. But I don't think there's a contradiction, because I don't think of Aadhaar as an important welfare initiative.
I didn't mean Aadhaar in particular, but in general the government is bad at handling the kind of management it takes and the distribution resources.
Well, that comes, you see, this brings us back to this issue of cynicism. I mean, it is certainly a valid point that many public programs in India are not working well. That I will be the last person to deny that. I am as worried as anybody else about corruption, inefficiency, and so on. And we have a lot of work to do in bringing more accountability, and not just accountability, but responsibility, which is not the same thing, in the public sector. But again, the experience is that these things can change. I mean, the RTI, the Right of Information Act, was a big step in the direction of greater accountability by creating transparency. Now, transparency is not the same as accountability, but it's an important part of it. Now, of course, you can take the view that nothing will change, kuch nahi hoga, but why? Are Indians genetically programmed to be corrupt or something? Or, I don't think so. And if you actually look at the recent experience, there was a time when Kerala was the only state that seemed to be able to run these programs. Then everyone else was here, and Kerala was a huge outlier. And people were asking, what is it about Kerala? What is it about Malayalis? Is it the history of matrilineal, or is it the missionary activity, or kya hai? But actually now what we are seeing is that many other states actually are showing that they can go the same way But they started much later. What Kerala really did, the big difference is that Kerala started very early in promoting universal education. That I think was the big factor. That is also the big factor that played a role later on in Tamil Nadu after independence, and later on in states like Himachal Pradesh when it became independent. So I don't see any fundamental reason why things couldn't get much better. But we have to work for it. And there's no guarantee. I mean, maybe the cynics will be proved right, and the public sector will remain inefficient and corrupt. But I think at the moment the evidence that there's a lot of scope for change. And since I mentioned the distinction between accountability and responsibility, think of this college. I'm guessing that there's a reasonably good standard and that the teachers actually turn up and teach and maybe even do it with a certain amount of passion and pride. Now, is it because they're accountable? Is it because their salaries is going to be cut because when they don't do it? No, I think it's because they feel that this is, I'm a teacher, I want to do well, I want my students to do well. Maybe I'm very naive, but this is ultimately what we should aspire to, not just accountability. Accountability is also important, but responsibility is also self-motivation. That will be a much better guarantee of well-functioning public services than just trying at every step to ensure that there's a system of rewards and punishment.
Yeah, so one second connected question after that. If you are moving ahead in the 21st century, knowing that we have all these problems regarding government's efficiency, we can find a technological solution to it, something akin to Aadhaar, maybe not as inefficient as it is. So what do you propose that technology would look like?
I am in favor of appropriate technology. I'm not at all against technology. I mean, there are many technologies that I've heard in the recent past, for example, in the context of some of these social programs, the MIS, like the first one was NREGA, the first one that had a really extensive MIS was NREGA, and that helped to bring a completely new level of transparency in the program, which is now becoming the norm in other programs, not just the social programs. So there are many technologies that can be well used, but technology in itself is not a guarantee of progress. There are also inappropriate technologies. And when you think of Aadhaar is by nature based on, it requires internet connectivity and biometrics, the biometric authentication part. Yeah, like for example in Jharkhand, in the PDS, the public distribution system now, Aadhaar-based biometric authentication is compulsory. Now you're imposing in a state where even in the state capital there are huge connectivity problems. You are suddenly imposing across the state a system that requires connectivity and biometrics, and also of course other things like the post machine to work and the mobiles to work and all that. It doesn't strike me as being very realistic, and indeed the results have been quite sobering. So you have to look at whether the technology is appropriate. But interestingly, yesterday in the RBI, some of the people we were talking to, they kept telling us, do you want to reverse technology? I mean, they said, this is like top first-rate technology, why would we want to withdraw it? So I think there's sometimes a danger of being over-impressed by technology and of thinking that technology by itself is going to give positive results. That may or may not be the case. Last question. Too many. Sorry. Okay, we'll try to take one more. Yeah. I'll give brief answers. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One is, you have the academic understanding of this issue, as well as you've stayed in such communities where you really are, I think, able to design probably process improvisation for the successful implementation of a policy. Probably maybe there is some fault in the policy implementation, may not be complete policy. So I wanted to understand if we have opportunity twice at the planning commission. You stepped down after 1 year.
Not the planning commission. I was in the National Advisory Council.
National Advisory Council, but you chose to step down as so I wanted to understand why was the decision.
Okay.
And
Okay.
sorry, the second,
Second?
I have
Another question? Okay.
which is primarily on the under-reporting of issues and the over-reporting of success parameters for any scheme that is launched. At the same time, when we talk about, for example, the ICDS, WCD has an underspent budget which it reports also. Is there a mechanism where we can challenge why the budget is unspent and give solutions, from the non-government sector?
Okay, I don't have too much to say on that particular issue because I've not really studied it. But of course, yes, we can. If the money is underspent, then we have to raise questions and try to ensure that it's, the money is better spent. On the first question, since I don't have time to reply in detail, I have written on this at some length, particularly issue of the relation between academic learning and experience. In the book that came out last year, the Jolawala Economics for Everyone, there's a long introduction which discusses that in detail, and in fact it's also available as a standalone article on the internet. It's called Economics Among the Rhodes Scholars, so you may be interested. NAC, I didn't really like being there. I mean, I joined it because I had certain ideas like, RTI Act and the Rural Employment Guarantee Act and so on. So somewhat reluctantly, I agreed to join, and I have no regrets. I mean, I think some good things happened in that time, but it's not my natural inclination to be in that kind of forum. So I prefer to go back to other things like research and writing and fieldwork. Last one, yeah.
Do you see any optimism in implementation of QUBI, or the fiscal repercussions venture into it?
Okay, this would require, it's not easy to give a short answer. But QUBI is the quasi-universal basic income. It's actually not QUBI, it's what I call QUIT, quasi-universal income top-up, because basic income, the original idea of basic income is that it should be enough to allow you to live, even if it means a simple life. Yeah, that was the original idea. That if you want to live if you prefer to not to work, and you're prepared to live a simple life, then you have that choice, because in any case you get the basic income, and of course, hopefully also some public services, and then you can choose to do something else. And I quite like this idea, because I'd like to think that many people in that situation might actually do a lot of interesting things, creative, socially useful. They might take interest in the environment or volunteer to do some childcare or something. I may be wrong. Maybe most of them will start drinking and taking drugs. I don't know. We don't know. I mean, the evidence as of now suggests that this fear that people will waste their time may not be founded. But we do need a lot more evidence on this. So I like the idea. But I think that for India, it's completely unrealistic for the time being, if you're talking of basic income. Okay. So therefore, if you look at the actual proposals, they are all about QUIT, quasi-universal income top-up. So, we'll give you something, but not a basic income. That is not necessarily a bad thing, but I feel that if the resources are limited for the time being, then better than that would be to start with priority programs like pensions and maternity entitlements, which are crying for more money. And we know that these programs are working, they are reaching the most vulnerable, they are doing a lot of good. So why not start there? And if you're not willing to do that, then what is the point of talking of QBI, UBI, QBI? This is just a time pass. I mean, there's no indication at the moment that the government has really serious interest in something like UBI. Yeah? And if they are not willing to take the first steps, then I don't see why we should go beyond that. I think let's do that first, and then yes, over time, I would be in favor, in due course, of even UBI, not just QBI or quit UBI. But so I think it's a long way for India at the moment. Thank you very much.
It's my privilege to present a vote of thanks for this session. On behalf of the Political Science Association and Wilson College, I'm really thank you, sir, for being here. And we are trying, I guess, since October, emails and all. So thank you very much, sir. I'm also thankful for students who came from different colleges. Thank you very much. Professors, ma'am, and of course all other Wilsonians. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I forgot to mention, the most important thing, that a lot of this work has been made possible by student volunteers who spend some time in the summer holidays roughing it out in the back of beyond of Bihar and Jharkhand and other states to help collect data and conduct social audits and so on and so forth. It's hard work, but I think many of them have found it a very interesting experience also. So in case you feel like volunteering this year or just being kept informed of what is going on, you can just send a line to hard work, no pay, 00. Hard work, no pay, 00 at gmail.com. Very easy to remember. Just ask to be added to the mailing list and you will be kept informed. Thank you.